The grand ballroom of the Lancaster Hotel in Boston sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the shimmer of evening gowns. Isabella Montgomery stood before the mirror in the bridal suite, her heart racing with anticipation. At 25, she was about to marry into one of New England's most prestigious families, and her simple background as a kindergarten teacher seemed like a distant memory. "You look absolutely perfect," whispered Sarah, her best friend since college days, adjusting the delicate lace veil. Isabella's emerald eyes glistened with tears of joy as she smoothed down her white silk gown, a dress she'd spent months saving for, working extra hours at Brighton Elementary School. The wedding was supposed to be her fairy tale ending. Alexander Preston IV, the charismatic CEO of Preston Industries, had swept her off her feet during a chance encounter at a charity gala. Their whirlwind romance had been the talk of Boston's elite social circles, though not always in a favorable light. Many wondered how a simple teacher had managed to capture the heart of one of Massachusetts' most eligible bachelors. "It's time," announced Margaret Preston, Alexander's mother, her voice crisp and formal as she entered the suite. Despite being her soon-to-be mother-in-law, Margaret had never warmed to Isabella, viewing her as an opportunistic social climber rather than the genuine, hard-working woman she truly was. Isabella took a deep breath and made her way to the grand staircase. The wedding march began to play, and hundreds of guests rose to their feet. Her heart swelled as she saw Alexander standing at the altar, handsome in his black tuxedo, his signature confident smile in place. But that smile didn't reach his eyes. Something was wrong. As Isabella reached the halfway point down the aisle, the music suddenly stopped. Alexander raised his hand, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. "I apologize to everyone who came here today," he announced, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "But this wedding cannot proceed." He turned to Isabella, his eyes cold. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your scheme?" Isabella's world began to spin. "What scheme?" "Alexander, what are you talking about?" "The pregnancy test, Isabella. The one you faked to trap me into marriage." He pulled out his phone and projected screenshots onto the massive screen intended for their wedding video. There were text messages, allegedly from Isabella to Sarah, discussing a plan to fake a pregnancy to force Alexander into marriage. "These are lies," Isabella cried out, turning to Sarah for support. But her best friend stood frozen, avoiding her gaze. The terrible truth dawned on Isabella: Sarah, her confidant of 7 years, had betrayed her. "Security will escort you out," Alexander continued, as two large men approached. "And Isabella? The authorities will be contacting you about the funds you've been embezzling from the Preston Foundation's charitable programs." "What? I never." Isabella's protests were drowned out by the gasps and whispers of hundreds of guests. She watched in horror as Margaret Preston smiled triumphantly, while Victoria Hawthorne, Alexander's executive assistant, slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining with familiar intimacy. It had all been a setup. Every moment, every kiss, every promise, all orchestrated to humiliate her publicly and destroy her reputation. As security dragged her toward the exit, Isabella caught a glimpse of her reflection in one of the grand mirrors. Her mascara had run down her cheeks, her carefully styled hair was disheveled, and her dream wedding dress was wrinkled and torn. But in her eyes, something changed. The innocent sparkle of love was replaced by a steely determination. That evening, as rain poured over Boston's cobblestone streets, Isabella sat alone in her tiny apartment in Somerville. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from concerned parents at her school and notifications of news articles already covering the scandal. Her career, reputation, and heart lay in shambles around her. She opened her laptop and began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she documented everything she knew about Preston Industries, every conversation she'd had with Alexander, every detail she'd observed during her time in their world. The prestigious Preston family had no idea that their perfectly orchestrated humiliation had awakened something in Isabella, not a desire for revenge, but a determination to expose the truth and reclaim her dignity. "You didn't just break my heart," she whispered to the rain-streaked window, watching the distant lights of Boston's financial district where the Preston Industries Tower dominated the skyline. "You gave me a purpose." In the corner of her apartment, a small stack of papers caught her eye, documents she'd discovered in Alexander's study weeks ago but had been too trusting to question. Now, with clear eyes, she pulled them out and began to read. What she found made her blood run cold, evidence of massive financial fraud that went far beyond anything they had falsely accused her of. Isabella Montgomery, the kindergarten teacher they'd tried to destroy, was about to learn that sometimes life's greatest victories come disguised as devastating defeats. And as she began to plan her next move, she remembered her favorite quote to tell her students: "A diamond is just a piece of coal that handled stress exceptionally well." The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. "Time to shine," she whispered to herself as lightning illuminated the Boston skyline, almost as if nature itself was signaling the start of her transformation. 3 months after the wedding disaster, Isabella sat in a small coffee shop in Cambridge, her appearance drastically changed. Gone were her flowing brown locks, replaced by a sophisticated platinum blonde bob. Her once soft teacher's wardrobe had given way to sharp business attire. But the biggest transformation wasn't visible, it was in her mind and heart. "Miss Montgomery?" A deep voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find James Crawford, a former SEC investigator turned private consultant, studying her with keen interest. "I have to admit, when you contacted me about Preston Industries, I was skeptical. But after reviewing the documents you sent..." He paused, glancing around before sitting down. "They're ironclad, aren't they?" Isabella smiled, sliding a fresh manila envelope across the table. "And these are just the beginning." James opened the envelope, his eyes widening. "This level of financial manipulation. How did you get these?" "Let's just say Alexander was careless around someone he underestimated," Isabella replied, stirring her untouched coffee. "The question is, can you help me build a case?" "It's dangerous," James warned. "The Prestons have connections everywhere. They've already managed to get you blacklisted from teaching in Massachusetts with those false embezzlement allegations." Isabella's jaw tightened at the reminder. The day after the wedding, she'd arrived at Brighton Elementary to find herself suspended pending investigation. The local papers had run with the story, painting her as a gold digger who'd tried to scam both the Preston family and an educational charity. Her students' parents, once warm and friendly, now avoided eye contact when they saw her in the grocery store. "I have nothing left to lose," she said quietly. "But everything to gain." Just then, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Her heart stopped as she read the headline: "Preston Industries announces merger with Hawthorne Enterprises, power couple Alexander Preston and Victoria Hawthorne to Wednesday." James watched her reaction carefully. "Are you sure this isn't about revenge?" Isabella looked up, her green eyes sharp. "This is about justice. The Prestons aren't just destroying lives through their personal games, they're ruining families through their corporate fraud. Those charity funds they accused me of embezzling? They've been siphoning money from them for years, leaving countless underprivileged children without the educational resources they were promised." She pulled out her laptop and showed James a spreadsheet. "See these numbers? Each one represents a child who won't get the textbooks, tutoring, or educational support they were guaranteed. That's why I became a teacher in the first place, to help children who needed it most. The Prestons took that away from me, but they won't take it from anyone else." As they discussed strategy, neither noticed the woman in dark sunglasses sitting 2 tables away, pretending to read while discreetly taking photos with her phone. Across town, in the Preston Industries Tower, Sarah Jenkins sat in Victoria Hawthorne's luxurious office, fidgeting nervously. "Isabella's changed," she reported. "She's not wallowing in depression like you expected. She's different." Victoria laughed, running her manicured fingers over her engagement ring, the same one Alexander had once given Isabella. "Different how? Is she planning to crash our wedding? Write a tell-all book?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "She's cut off contact with everyone from her old life. But she's been seen meeting with financial experts, lawyers." Victoria's smile faded. "Have you forgotten what we have on you, Sarah? The real reason you helped us set up your former best friend?" Sarah paled. "No, I haven't forgotten." "Then find out what she's planning. We can't have any loose ends before the merger announcement next month." Meanwhile, Isabella had moved to a small apartment in Beacon Hill, funded by the sale of every luxury item Alexander had ever given her. Her new neighbor, Michael Chen, a data analyst at a competing firm, had become her unexpected ally after recognizing certain irregularities in Preston Industries' public financial statements. The problem, Michael explained that evening as they reviewed documents spread across his living room floor, is that they've hidden their tracks too well. We need someone on the inside. Isabella stared at the Preston Industries tower visible from Michael's window. What if we already have someone? Someone who doesn't even know they're helping us yet? She pulled out her phone and showed Michael a photo of Thomas Preston, Alexander's younger brother, known for his rebellious nature and strained relationship with the family. Recent tabloid photos showed him looking worse for wear, clearly struggling with personal demons. The black sheep of the Preston family, Michael mused. But how do you plan to approach him? Isabella smiled. As someone who knows exactly what it feels like to be cast aside by the Prestons. She pulled out a business card for the Hope Haven Rehabilitation Center. Thomas checked himself in here last week. They're always looking for volunteer counselors. That's brilliant and terrifying, Michael said. But Isabella, getting close to Thomas Preston, it could backfire spectacularly. Sometimes you have to walk straight into the lion's den, she replied, remembering how she'd once taught her kindergartners about facing their fears. Besides, I learned something valuable from Alexander Preston: keep your friends close, and your enemies closer. That night, as Isabella prepared for bed, her phone chimed with an email from an anonymous sender. Inside was a single photo, taken that morning at the coffee shop with James Crawford, along with a message: back off while you still can. Instead of feeling frightened, Isabella felt energized. They were watching her, which meant they were worried. She opened her laptop and began filling out the volunteer application for Hope Haven, her hands steady as she typed. In the Preston mansion, Margaret Preston was hosting a dinner party celebrating Alexander and Victoria's engagement. As champagne flowed and Boston's elite offered their congratulations, she noticed her son staring at his phone, his face troubled. "Darling, what's wrong?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," Alexander replied quickly, but his eyes betrayed him as he looked at the photo on his screen, Isabella's new blonde hair gleaming in the coffee shop light as she consulted with a man he recognized as a former SEC investigator. For the first time since the wedding, he felt a flicker of unease. "Should we be worried?" Victoria asked, appearing at his side. Alexander forced a smile. "About a disgraced kindergarten teacher? Don't be absurd." But later that night, he made a call to increase security at all Preston Industries locations and ordered a deeper background check on Isabella's recent activities. As the city slept, Isabella stood at her window, watching the same stars she used to wish upon. But she wasn't wishing anymore, she was planning, calculating, and preparing. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, very soon, the true face of the Preston Empire would be revealed to the world. In her hand, she held a small silver locket, a gift from one of her former students on what should have been her wedding day. Inside was inscribed a simple message: teachers change the world one child at a time. And sometimes, Isabella whispered to the night, they change it by exposing the truth, one secret at a time. Hope Haven Rehabilitation Center sat nestled in the peaceful outskirts of Worcester, Massachusetts, its Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the modern security systems discreetly installed throughout the property. Isabella adjusted her volunteer badge, her heart racing as she walked through the elegant gardens where patients often spent their afternoons. 2 weeks into her volunteer work, she had yet to make direct contact with Thomas Preston. She glimpsed him several times, his tall frame hunched over during group therapy sessions, his once handsome face bearing the marks of his struggles. Despite sharing the Preston family's striking blue eyes, Thomas carried none of their aristocratic arrogance. "Miss Blake?" One of the nurses called out, using Isabella's mother's maiden name, her new identity for this role. "Would you mind leading the afternoon art therapy session?" Mrs. Henderson called in sick. Isabella's pulse quickened. She knew from her careful research that Thomas attended every art therapy session, finding solace in painting landscapes that looked nothing like Boston's urban sprawl. "Of course," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I'd be happy to help." The art room was flooded with natural light, easels arranged in a circle. As patients filtered in, Thomas took his usual spot by the window. Isabella began distributing supplies, her hands trembling slightly as she approached him. "Watercolors today?" she asked softly. Thomas looked up, and for a moment, Isabella feared recognition. But his eyes were clear and unknowing. "Yes, please. Though I doubt I'll create anything worth keeping." "Sometimes the act of creation itself is what matters," she replied, remembering similar words she'd once spoken to her kindergarten students. As the session progressed, Isabella moved between patients, offering gentle encouragement. When she reached Thomas again, she paused to study his painting, a solitary lighthouse against a stormy sea. "It's beautiful," she said truthfully. "But rather lonely." Thomas's brush stilled. "Aren't we all?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Sorry, that's probably too heavy for an art therapy session." "There's no such thing as too heavy when you're healing," Isabella responded, carefully building the connection. "The lighthouse still stands despite the storm." "That says something about resilience, doesn't it?" Before Thomas could respond, a commotion at the door drew their attention. Victoria Hawthorne stood in the doorway, designer handbag clutched tightly as she surveyed the room. Isabella's heart stopped, but years of teaching had taught her to maintain composure in crisis. She turned away casually, busying herself with cleaning brushes as Victoria approached Thomas. "Your mother sent me," Victoria announced, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "She's concerned about how this retreat will look during the merger announcements." Thomas's response was quiet but firm. "Tell her I don't care how it looks. I'm doing this for me." Isabella risked a glance. Victoria was leaning close to Thomas, speaking in hushed tones that didn't quite reach her ears. Whatever she said caused Thomas to pale slightly before his jaw set in a familiar Preston expression of defiance. "Get out," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And tell my dear brother his wedding gift from me will be my continued silence. That's worth more than anything on their registry, isn't it?" Victoria's heels clicked angrily against the hardwood floors as she left. Isabella watched Thomas return to his painting, his brushstrokes now aggressive, the lighthouse almost disappearing beneath dark waves. That evening, in Michael Chen's apartment, Isabella recounted the scene. "Thomas knows something," she concluded. "Something they're desperate to keep quiet." Michael nodded, pulling up financial records on his laptop. "I think I might know what. Look at these transactions from 3 years ago, right before Thomas's first stint in rehab." The numbers told a story of massive transfers, hidden beneath layers of shell companies. All leading back to a single incident at a Preston Industries chemical plant in Michigan. "There was a cover-up," Michael explained. "Official reports say it was a minor leak, quickly contained. But I found sealed medical records, environmental impact studies that never made it to the EPA. And Thomas knows the truth," Isabella finished. "That's why they keep him close despite his issues. He's a liability." Her phone buzzed, a text from James Crawford, "Emergency. Meet at the usual place. Now." The usual place was a 24-hour diner in Somerville, deliberately chosen for its constant flow of students and late-night workers. James was already there, looking more disheveled than Isabella had ever seen him. "They know," he said without preamble. "Someone leaked that you're gathering evidence. They're moving everything offshore, destroying records. We need to move faster." Isabella felt the weight of her silver locket against her chest. "Then we changed the plan. Instead of building a perfect case, we need a smoking gun," James finished. "Something so big they can't bury it." "The chemical plant records," Isabella suggested. "If we can get Thomas to talk." James shook his head. "Too risky. They're watching him too closely now." He hesitated before continuing. "There might be another way. Victoria Hawthorne's assistant contacted me. Says she has proof of illegal dealings, but she's scared." "It could be a trap," Isabella warned. "Probably is," James agreed. "But can we afford not to check?" Before Isabella could respond, her phone lit up with a news alert. Her blood ran cold as she read the headline, "Tragic accident at Hope Haven Rehabilitation Center, Thomas Preston in critical condition." "That's not an accident," she whispered, gathering her things. "That's a warning." Across the city, in Massachusetts General Hospital, Alexander Preston stood at his brother's bedside, listening to the steady beep of monitors. "You stupid, selfish fool," he muttered. Why couldn't you just stay quiet? Victoria appeared in the doorway. The doctors say he'll recover. Eventually. She paused. We need to talk about the volunteer art therapist at Hope Haven. The blonde? There's something familiar about her. Alexander waved dismissively. Have security run a background check if you're worried. But right now, we need to focus on damage control. The merger announcement is in 2 weeks. In her apartment, Isabella paced as she listened to Michael read Thomas's medical report, obtained through his network of contacts. They're saying it was an accidental overdose, but the toxicology report shows a mixture of substances he hadn't used in months. Isabella stopped pacing. They tried to kill him to keep him quiet. Her voice was cold. Change of plans. I'm done playing the long game. She pulled out the business card Victoria's assistant had given James. Sometimes the most obvious trap was also the best opportunity. Isabella, Michael warned, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking. Call James, she interrupted. Tell him to set up the meeting with Victoria's assistant. And then call in every favor you have at the SEC. When this breaks, we need to make sure they can't bury it. She opened her laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard as she typed an email to Sarah, her former best friend. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk about what they really have on you." As dawn broke over Boston, Isabella stood in front of her mirror, applying the finishing touches to her disguise. The blonde hair was gone, replaced by a rich auburn that matched the fierce determination in her eyes. On her bed lay an invitation to the Preston Industries merger announcement gala, obtained through means she preferred not to think about. Time to crash another Preston party, she whispered to her reflection. But this time, I'm not the one who'll be humiliated. In his hospital room, Thomas Preston's eyes flickered open. Through the haze of medication, he focused on the small card someone had left by his bedside. It bore a simple message: the lighthouse still stands despite the storm. When you're ready to tell the truth, call this number. The game was changing, and Isabella was done playing by their rules. The next move would shake the Preston empire to its foundations, if it didn't destroy her first. The upscale Beacon Hill Cafe was nearly empty when Sarah Jenkins slipped in, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed nervously on the marble tabletop as she waited, jumping slightly when Isabella silently appeared across from her. You look different, Sarah managed, taking in Isabella's auburn hair and sharp business attire. Amazing what betrayal can do for one's appearance, Isabella replied coolly. But we're not here to discuss my makeover, are we? Sarah glanced around nervously. They'll know I met with you. Of course they will. That's part of the plan. Isabella laid her phone on the table, screen up, showing a series of damaging documents. Just like they knew about your brother's involvement in that hedge fund scandal 3 years ago. The one they used to blackmail you into helping them destroy me. The color drained from Sarah's face. How did you? The better question is, how did they? Isabella leaned forward. Because I found something interesting when I dug deeper. The SEC investigation into your brother's firm? It was initiated by Preston Industries' legal team. They created the very scandal they used to control you. Sarah's hands began to shake as the realization dawned. No, that's not possible. Victoria Hawthorne personally orchestrated it, Isabella continued, sliding an envelope across the table. Here's proof. They didn't just use you, Sarah. They set up your entire family. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she read the documents. I thought I was protecting my brother, all this time. You can still protect him, Isabella said, her voice softening slightly. But first, you need to protect yourself. In 3 days, you're scheduled to testify at the Preston Industries shareholder meeting about my alleged embezzlement. They've given you a script, haven't they? Sarah nodded mutely. Well, I'm giving you a choice instead. Meanwhile, across town at Massachusetts General Hospital, Thomas Preston was receiving an unexpected visitor. Michael Chen, posing as a physical therapist, helped him through his prescribed exercises while carefully steering their conversation. The doctors say the mixture of drugs in your system was unusual, Michael commented casually. Almost as if someone knew exactly what combination would be most dangerous. Thomas's hands clenched on his walking frame. "You're not really a physical therapist, are you?" "No," Michael admitted. "But I am someone who knows about the Michigan plant. And what really happened there." Thomas stopped walking, his face ashen. "Get out. Your brother tried to have you killed," Michael pressed. "How long before they try again? How many more lives need to be destroyed before?" "You don't understand," Thomas interrupted, his voice breaking. "It's not just about the chemical spill. What happened in Michigan, it was just the beginning. There are other sites, other cover-ups. The merger with Hawthorne Enterprises isn't just about business, it's about hiding evidence." Before Michael could respond, the door opened. Victoria Hawthorne stood there, her face a mask of fury. "Security," she called sharply. Michael slipped out another door as security guards rushed in, but he'd gotten what he came for. In the confusion, Thomas had pressed a small USB drive into his hand. At her apartment, Isabella was reviewing the information from Victoria's assistant, Rachel Turner, when James Crawford burst in, looking panicked. "Rachel's dead," he announced without preamble. "Car accident on the way to meet us. Police are calling it a brake failure." Isabella's blood ran cold. "They're tying up loose ends before the merger announcement." "It gets worse," James continued. "They've moved up the shareholder meeting. It's tomorrow, not in 3 days. They must know we're close to something." Isabella's phone buzzed, a message from Michael, "Got something from Thomas. Big. Meet at my place ASAP." As she grabbed her coat, another message came through, this one from Sarah, "They know. Victoria just called an emergency board meeting. Whatever you're planning, do it fast." The next few hours were a blur of activity. In Michael's apartment, they reviewed the contents of Thomas's USB drive, the evidence more damning than they could have imagined. Isabella's hands shook as she read through document after document. "It's not just Michigan," she whispered. "They've been systematically covering up environmental violations across the country. The merger with Hawthorne, it's because Victoria's company owns the labs that have been falsifying the environmental impact reports." "And the charitable foundations?" James asked. "Money laundering," Michael confirmed, pointing to a spreadsheet. "They've been using the education initiatives to hide the payments to silence whistleblowers." Isabella stood abruptly. "We need to move now. The shareholder meeting is in 12 hours. Sarah will be there to testify. If they've really moved it up, they might try to silence her too," James finished grimly. "Not if we silence them first," Isabella replied, pulling out her invitation to the meeting. "But we need to be smart about this. Victoria will have heightened security after what happened with Rachel." She turned to Michael. "Can you get into their network? We need control of the presentation systems in the main conference room." "Already working on it," he replied, fingers flying over his keyboard. "But Isabella, this is dangerous. After Rachel, they won't kill me in front of their shareholders," Isabella said with grim certainty. "Their whole empire is built on maintaining appearances. That's their weakness, and our opportunity." As midnight approached, Alexander Preston sat in his office atop the Preston Industries Tower, reviewing the speech he would give announcing the merger. Victoria perched on his desk, looking troubled. "That volunteer from Hope Haven," she said. "I had security run that background check. Catherine Blake doesn't exist, at least, not the one who was working there." Alexander's head snapped up. "What? And there's more. Sarah Jenkins missed our prep meeting this afternoon. Her phone's going straight to voicemail." Alexander stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. "Find Sarah. Now. And double security for tomorrow. No one gets into that meeting without complete verification." "What about the press?" "They stay in the designated media area." "No exceptions." He turned back to Victoria. "Tomorrow has to go perfectly. Everything we've worked for depends on it." In her apartment, Isabella laid out her clothes for the morning, not the designer brands she'd worn as Alexander's fiancée, but a sharp black suit that meant business. On her bed lay the evidence they'd gathered: Thomas's USB drive, Rachel's documents, proof of Sarah's blackmail, and the Michigan cover-up files. Her phone lit up with a text from Sarah: "They're looking for me. I'm scared." Isabella replied quickly, "Stay at the safe house. It's almost over." As she prepared for bed, Isabella took off her locket, the one from her former student. Inside, she placed a small microchip containing backup copies of all their evidence. If something went wrong tomorrow, at least the truth would survive. One way or another, she whispered to her reflection, tomorrow the Preston empire falls. In his hospital room, Thomas Preston watched the news coverage of the upcoming merger announcement. His hand hovered over his phone, Isabella's card with its cryptic message sitting beside it. Finally, he began to dial. The pieces were in place. In less than 12 hours, the carefully constructed facade of Preston Industries would begin to crack. But in Boston's high-stakes world of power and privilege, even the best-laid plans could unravel in an instant. And Isabella was walking straight into the lion's den again. Only this time, she wasn't wearing white. Dawn broke over Boston's financial district, painting the Preston Industries Tower in shades of gold and crimson. Isabella stood in her apartment, watching the sunrise reflect off the building's windows as she fastened her mother's pearl earrings, the only piece of her old life she'd kept besides the locket. Her phone buzzed with a message from Michael: "Systems breached. We're ready." Another text followed, this one from James: "SEC team on standby. Remember, we need them to incriminate themselves on record." The final message came from Thomas Preston: "I'm checking out of the hospital. Whatever happens today, I won't hide anymore." Isabella took a deep breath, checking her reflection one final time. The auburn-haired woman who stared back bore little resemblance to the naive kindergarten teacher who'd once dreamed of becoming Mrs. Preston. Her green eyes, once soft with love, now held steel. The Preston Industries lobby was a hive of activity when she arrived. Shareholders and media representatives crowded the security checkpoints, all buzzing about the surprise merger announcement. Isabella joined the line, her forged credentials prepared for inspection. "ID, please," the security guard requested. Isabella's heart pounded as she handed over the badge identifying her as Catherine Blake, representing a minor investment firm. The guard scanned it, and for a moment, she feared Michael's hack hadn't worked. "Proceed to the 40th floor," he said finally, returning her badge. In the elevator, Isabella touched her locket for reassurance. Inside, along with the microchip, she'd placed a small photo of her former kindergarten class. "Remember why you're doing this," she whispered to herself. The 40th floor conference room was already filling with Boston's business elite. Isabella took her assigned seat near the back, noting the heavy security presence around the room. Victoria Hawthorne stood near the podium, looking flawless in a designer suit, while Alexander chatted confidently with board members. A commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. Sarah Jenkins had arrived, looking pale but determined. Victoria immediately moved to intercept her, but Sarah walked straight to the podium. "Mrs. Hawthorne," the tech coordinator called out, "we're ready for your presentation review." Victoria hesitated, torn between stopping Sarah and maintaining appearances. "Fine," she snapped, following the coordinator to a side room. "But nobody starts without me." Isabella's phone vibrated silently, Victoria's computer accessed. "Standing by. Michael." The minutes ticked by. More shareholders arrived. Isabella noticed Margaret Preston entering with her usual regal bearing, pausing to kiss Alexander's cheek before taking her seat in the front row. Suddenly, the lights dimmed. On the massive screens behind the podium, the Preston Industries logo appeared. But instead of the planned presentation, a video began to play. It was security footage from the Michigan chemical plant, dated 3 years ago. The room watched in horror as the scene unfolded, workers rushing to contain a catastrophic leak, followed by footage of secret midnight operations to hide evidence of contamination. Alexander lunged for the control panel, but nothing he pressed would stop the video. As it continued, documents began appearing on screen: internal memos, falsified reports, payoff records. "Stop this immediately," Margaret Preston commanded, but her voice was drowned out by the growing murmurs from the shareholders. The screen switched to more recent footage, Thomas Preston in a board meeting 3 years ago, arguing desperately about the need to clean up the contaminated sites. Then came the documents showing how the Preston family had orchestrated his downfall, pushing him toward addiction to discredit his claims. Isabella stood, removing her auburn wig to reveal her natural brown hair. "I believe we should discuss a different kind of merger," she announced, her voice carrying across the now silent room. "The merger of truth with consequences." Alexander's face contorted with fury as he recognized her. "Security." "I wouldn't," Isabella warned. "The SEC has already received copies of everything you're seeing. And there's more." She nodded to Sarah, who stepped forward. "The testimony you wanted me to give today was a lie," Sarah declared, her voice shaking but clear. "Isabella Montgomery never embezzled funds. The Preston Foundation was used to hide illegal payments and environmental cover-ups. I know because I was blackmailed into helping hide the evidence." The doors burst open. Thomas Preston walked in, pale but steady, followed by a team of FBI agents. "Everything she's saying is true," he announced. "And I'm ready to testify." Victoria chose that moment to return from the tech room. She froze in the doorway, taking in the scene before her. "Alexander, what's happening?" "What's happening," Isabella replied for him, "is that your house of cards is falling. Those contaminated sites you've been hiding? The families you've been paying off? The charities you've been using as fronts? It's all coming to light." The screens now showed a map of Preston Industries facilities across the country, with red dots indicating compromised sites. Each of these locations represents lives destroyed, communities poisoned, all to protect your profits and your precious reputation. Margaret Preston stood, her composure finally cracking. "You have no idea what you're doing, you foolish girl. Do you know how many jobs depend on this company? How many lives you're affecting?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," Isabella replied calmly. "I'm thinking of the children in Michigan who can't play outside because their playground is built on contaminated soil. I'm thinking of the families who lost loved ones to mysterious illnesses that your doctors were paid to misdiagnose." She turned to address the shareholders directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have a choice to make. The SEC and FBI are prepared to work with cooperative witnesses. Those who knew nothing of these crimes will be protected. But those who helped cover them up." She let the implication hang in the air. The room erupted in chaos. Shareholders began shouting questions, reporters who had sneaked in started taking photos, and security looked utterly confused about who they should be restraining. Alexander made a desperate move toward Isabella, but Thomas stepped between them. "It's over, brother," he said quietly. "For once in your life, face the consequences of your actions." Victoria tried to slip away in the confusion, but found her path blocked by FBI agents. "Victoria Hawthorne," one announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and environmental violations." As handcuffs clicked around Victoria's wrists, she spat at Isabella, "You think this makes you special? You're still just a kindergarten teacher who wasn't good enough for this world." Isabella smiled. "You're right about one thing, I am a teacher. And today's lesson was about justice." Sarah approached Isabella, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, for everything." "I know," Isabella replied softly. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to find out who we really are." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, storm clouds gathered over Boston, as if nature itself was marking the fall of the Preston Empire. As FBI agents led Alexander and Victoria away, Isabella caught his eye one final time. The man she had once loved looked small now, stripped of his power and pretense. Margaret Preston remained in her seat, watching her carefully constructed world crumble around her. "You'll never understand what it takes to build something like this," she said as Isabella passed by. "No," Isabella agreed. "But I understand what it takes to tell the truth. Something you should have taught your children." Outside the Preston Industries Tower, reporters swarmed as Alexander, Victoria, and several board members were led to waiting FBI vehicles. Thunder rolled overhead as the storm finally broke, rain washing over the city like tears of relief. Isabella stood under her umbrella, watching as years of lies and corruption were finally exposed to the cleansing rain. Her phone buzzed one last time, a message from her former school principal: "We owe you an apology. Your job is waiting when you're ready." But Isabella wasn't sure she would return to teaching, at least not yet. There were more corporate giants out there, more lies to expose, more justice to be served. She had found a new calling. Thomas joined her under the umbrella, looking both exhausted and relieved. "What now?" he asked. "Now," Isabella replied, watching the rain fall on the city she had once again made her own, "we rebuild. But this time, we do it right." The storm continued to rage, but for the first time in months, Isabella felt completely at peace. The lighthouse had withstood the storm, just as she had promised Thomas it would. 1 month after the fall of Preston Industries, Boston's financial district was still reeling from the aftershocks. Isabella sat in her new office at the Renaissance Foundation, a non-profit organization she'd established using her settlement money from the Preston family's legal team. The view wasn't as spectacular as the Preston Towers, but it felt honest. "The Michigan site cleanup starts next week," Michael reported, sliding a folder across her desk. He'd become the foundation's head of research, his data analysis skills now directed toward tracking corporate environmental violations. "The EPA's using our evidence to fast-track the process." Isabella nodded, but her attention was drawn to the television mounted on her wall. Alexander Preston's face filled the screen as reporters swarmed him outside the federal courthouse. "Mr. Preston, how do you respond to allegations that more sites remain undisclosed?" a reporter shouted. Alexander's usual confidence had dimmed during his month in custody, but his smile remained practiced. "No comment. But I assure you, Preston Industries has always prioritized." Isabella muted the TV. "He's still lying." "Of course he is," Sarah agreed, entering with coffee. After providing key testimony against the Prestons, she joined the foundation's outreach team, working to connect with other corporate whistleblowers. But his lawyers can't save him this time. The evidence is too strong. Isabella's phone buzzed, a text from Thomas: "Need to meet. It's urgent." The usual place. The usual place had become a small coffee shop in Cambridge, far from the financial district's prying eyes. Thomas was already there when Isabella arrived, looking better than she'd ever seen him. Sobriety suited him. "They're planning something," he said without preamble. "Margaret visited Alexander in custody yesterday. She had papers with her, documents I'd never seen before." Isabella's instincts flared. "What kind of documents?" "I don't know, but afterward, Alexander demanded an emergency meeting with his legal team." Thomas leaned forward. "Isabella, you need to be careful. My mother doesn't lose gracefully." As if on cue, Isabella's phone exploded with notifications. Breaking news alerts flooded her screen. Preston Industries whistleblower exposed: Isabella Montgomery's dark past. Her blood ran cold as she opened the first link. There, in harsh black and white, were school records, police reports, and court documents, all painting a picture of a troubled young woman with a history of fraud and mental instability. "These are fake," she whispered, scanning the documents. "They've fabricated my entire history." "It gets worse," Michael texted. "They're claiming you orchestrated everything, the Michigan evidence, the environmental reports, all of it, as part of an elaborate revenge scheme. They're saying you manipulated Thomas's addiction to get false testimony." Isabella's hands shook as more news alerts arrived. Local stations were already running with the story: former teacher's vendetta, was Preston Industries framed? "We need to respond," Sarah urged over the phone. "The foundation's partners are getting nervous." But Isabella sat frozen, watching her carefully reconstructed life threatening to crumble again. Then she noticed something in one of the fabricated documents, a tiny detail that made her smile. "They made a mistake," she told Thomas. "These records claim I was in a Boston hospital on March 15, 2020. But I have proof I was teaching in Chicago that day, hundreds of witnesses, plus video from our school's virtual learning program during the pandemic lockdown." She stood, determination replacing fear. "They're not just attacking me anymore. They're threatening everything we've built, all the people we're trying to help." Back at the foundation, Isabella called an emergency meeting. Her team gathered quickly: Michael, Sarah, James, and several new members who joined their cause after the Preston exposure. They're desperate, James observed, reviewing the fake documents. This kind of clumsy fabrication, it's not their usual style. Because Margaret Preston didn't orchestrate this, Isabella realized. Victoria did. From custody. She pulled up Victoria's visitor logs. Look who's been meeting with her, Linda Chen. My sister? Michael asked, surprised. Your sister who works at one of the top public relations firms in Boston, Isabella corrected. Victoria's trying to spin this through the media while Margaret and Alexander work the legal angle. Sarah's face paled. There's more. They're claiming I was in on it with you from the beginning, that the blackmail story was part of our plan. Isabella stood at the window, watching the city below. Somewhere out there, Margaret Preston was probably feeling very pleased with herself. The question was, how to turn this attack into an opportunity. Her phone rang, an unknown number. Miss Montgomery, a woman's voice asked. This is Andrea Sullivan from the Boston Globe. We're running a story about the allegations against you, and I was hoping to get your comment. Isabella's mind raced, then settled on a decision. Actually, Miss Sullivan, I'd like to invite you to the foundation. There's something you should see. 2 hours later, Andrea Sullivan sat in Isabella's office, reviewing documents spread across the conference table. Real documents, Isabella's complete history, including her teaching records, character references, and most importantly, dated video evidence of her whereabouts during key times. The Preston documents claim she was elsewhere. Why are you showing me all this? Andrea asked. Because the truth isn't just about documents, Ms. Sullivan. It's about people. Isabella pressed a button, and the wall screen came to life with a video conference. On screen were faces from Michigan, from other contaminated sites, from communities the foundation was helping. One by one, they told their stories. Parents whose children had developed mysterious illnesses. Workers who'd been silenced. Families who'd lost everything when Preston Industries buried the truth. They're trying to discredit me because they think it will discredit these people, Isabella explained. But their stories deserve to be heard. Andrea's fingers flew across her notebook. This is comprehensive. But why give this to me? The Globe hasn't exactly been friendly to your cause. Because you have a reputation for fairness, Isabella replied. And because I believe even those who doubted me deserve to know the truth. As Andrea left with her story, Isabella received another text from Thomas. Mother just called an emergency board meeting for the remaining Preston Industries shareholders. Tomorrow morning. Let them meet, Isabella replied. We have nothing to hide. That evening, as her team worked to counter the Preston allegations, Isabella visited her old school in Brighton. The playground was empty, but lights still burned in some classrooms where teachers prepared for the next day. Her former principal, Dr. Harris, met her at the entrance. The offer still stands, he said quietly. Your classroom is waiting. Isabella touched her locket, thinking of the children she'd taught, the lives she'd hoped to shape. I'm still teaching, she replied. Just different lessons now. Back at her apartment, she found an unmarked envelope had been slipped under her door. Inside was a single photograph, Isabella in her wedding dress. At the moment everything fell apart. Scrawled across it in Victoria's handwriting, history repeats itself. But as Isabella looked at the photo, she didn't see defeat. She saw the moment that had made her stronger. Her phone buzzed with a message from Andrea Sullivan. Story runs tomorrow morning. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. Thunder rolled across Boston's night sky, but this time, Isabella wasn't alone in the storm. She had built something stronger than the Preston Empire. She had built a foundation of truth. And tomorrow, when Margaret Preston's latest attack fell apart, that foundation would stand stronger than ever. In her prison cell, Victoria Hawthorne watched the evening news coverage of the allegations against Isabella. Her smile faded as she noticed something in the background of one shot, Thomas Preston, entering the foundation's offices with a thick folder under his arm. What are you up to, dear brother-in-law, she muttered, reaching for her contraband phone to warn Alexander. But she was too late. The truth was already in motion, and this time, not even the Prestons could stop it. The Boston Globe's headline blazed across the city, Preston conspiracy deepens, attempted character assassination backfires. Andrea Sullivan's article wasn't just a defense of Isabella, it was a devastating exposé of the Prestons' desperate tactics, complete with irrefutable evidence of their document fabrication. Isabella stood in her office at the Renaissance Foundation, watching Margaret Preston's emergency shareholder meeting through the live feed Michael had managed to access. The elegant matriarch's composure was cracking as she faced a room full of angry investors. "The Globe's article is nothing but sensationalism," Margaret insisted, but her voice wavered. "We have proof that Isabella Montgomery is standing right here," Isabella announced, walking into the meeting room. The shareholders turned as one, whispers rippling through the crowd. "And I brought some friends." Behind her came Thomas Preston, Andrea Sullivan, and, most surprisingly, Linda Chen, Michael's sister from the PR firm. "Linda has something to share," Isabella said calmly, even as security moved toward her. "About who really ordered the fabrication of those documents." Linda stepped forward, her professional demeanor masking her nervousness. "2 weeks ago, Victoria Hawthorne contacted our firm through an intermediary. She offered an enormous sum to create a smear campaign against Isabella Montgomery. We..." She glanced apologetically at her brother Michael, who had just entered. "We accepted the job. But what they asked us to do wasn't just PR. They wanted us to create false documents, plant false stories." Margaret's face had gone pale. "This is absurd. Security, remove them immediately." "I wouldn't," Thomas warned. "The SEC is already on their way. And this time, Mother, they have everything. Including your offshore accounts." Isabella watched as comprehension dawned on Margaret's face. "The Michigan documents weren't all Thomas gave me," she explained. "He also had copies of your personal financial records. Every bribe, every payoff, every shell company, all traced back to you." "You ungrateful child," Margaret hissed at Thomas. "After everything we did to protect you." "Protect me?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "You destroyed me to protect yourselves. But that ends today." The doors burst open as SEC agents entered, led by James Crawford. "Margaret Preston," he announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice." As the agents moved to detain her, Margaret turned to Isabella with a look of grudging respect. "You really did learn from us, didn't you? The long game. The careful planning. The perfect timing." "No," Isabella replied softly. "I learned from my kindergarten students. The truth always comes out in the end." Hours later, Isabella sat in her office, watching news coverage of Margaret's arrest. Sarah entered with coffee and a thick envelope. "The last of the Michigan families signed onto the class action lawsuit," she reported. "And there's something else you should see." Inside the envelope were letters, dozens of them, from her former students' parents. Messages of support, of apology, of gratitude for showing their children what real strength looked like. Isabella's phone buzzed, a message from Alexander's lawyer requesting a meeting. "He wants to make a deal," she told Sarah. "Probably offering to testify against Victoria in exchange for leniency. Are you going to take it?" Before Isabella could answer, Thomas rushed in. "We have a problem. Victoria's escaped custody." Isabella's blood ran cold. "How?" "Bribed a guard. She's been planning this for weeks, apparently. And..." He hesitated. "She's not alone. My mother made bail an hour ago." They were last seen heading to Logan Airport. Michael appeared in the doorway, laptop in hand. Their private jet filed a flight plan for the Cayman Islands. "They're running." Isabella stood, a strange calm settling over her. "No. They're not running. They're going for the money." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. "The hidden accounts. The ones even Alexander doesn't know about." "Exactly. And once they access those accounts..." Isabella turned to Michael. "Can you track them?" He nodded. "Already on it. But Isabella, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, call James," she instructed. "Tell him to get the FBI to Logan immediately. Then contact Andrea Sullivan. It's time for the final story." Sarah grabbed her arm. You can't confront them alone. Victoria's desperate now. Desperate people are dangerous. I won't be alone, Isabella replied, touching her locket. I haven't been alone since the day they tried to destroy me. The next hour was a blur of activity. As FBI teams mobilized toward Logan Airport, Isabella and Thomas raced through Boston's rain-slicked streets. Michael's voice guided them through their earpieces, tracking Victoria and Margaret's movements through security cameras and phone signals. They're in Terminal E, he reported. Private aviation section. But something's wrong. They're not heading for their jet. Isabella's eyes widened as realization struck. The commercial flights. They're trying to disappear into regular traffic. Which flight? Checking manifests. Got it. British Airways to London, departing in 40 minutes. They booked under aliases we didn't flag. As they pulled up to the terminal, Isabella's phone rang. Andrea Sullivan. I've got a crew on the way, the reporter said. Whatever happens, we'll make sure the world sees it. Inside the terminal, Isabella and Thomas split up, coordinating with the FBI teams that were quietly taking position. Regular passengers hurried past, unaware of the drama unfolding around them. Then Isabella spotted them, Victoria and Margaret, both in disguise, moving toward the security checkpoint. But something in their bearing gave them away. The Preston pride couldn't be hidden under any disguise. Stop, Isabella called out, her voice carrying across the terminal. Heads turned. Phones came out, recording. It's over. Victoria spun around, her eyes wild. You! She reached into her bag, and several passengers screamed as she pulled out a small revolver. Really, Victoria? Isabella remained calm, even as FBI agents moved into position. More violence? More lies? Haven't you learned anything? Learned? Victoria laughed hysterically. I learned that people like you will always try to tear down their betters. That the weak use truth and justice as weapons because they can't compete on merit. Put the gun down, Margaret ordered her almost daughter-in-law. You're making a scene. A scene? Victoria turned on her. Like the scene you made destroying Isabella's wedding? Or the scene you made covering up how you poisoned entire communities? Isabella took a step forward. Victoria, look around. Look at all these phones recording. Whatever happens next, there's no more hiding. No more spinning the story. Just truth. Truth? Victoria's hand shook. The truth is, you were never good enough for our world. You were just a simple teacher who taught children about right and wrong, Isabella finished. Who showed them that sometimes the biggest bullies are the ones in business suits. Who proved that the truth always comes out. FBI agents were closing in. Margaret seemed to deflate, her shoulders sagging as she realized it was truly over. But Victoria's finger tightened on the trigger. Victoria, Thomas spoke up, think about Alexander. He's cooperating now, trying to make things right. Don't make it worse. For a moment, something flickered in Victoria's eyes, doubt, perhaps, or fear. Then, suddenly, she turned the gun toward Margaret. This is all your fault. You and your precious family name. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Margaret stepped back. Victoria's fingers squeezed. Isabella lunged forward. The shot echoed through the terminal. But it was Victoria who fell, tackled by FBI agents as the bullet harmlessly struck a ceiling tile. As they led her away in handcuffs, she locked eyes with Isabella one last time. You've won, she spat. Are you happy now? Isabella watched as both Victoria and Margaret were led away, their designer disguises disheveled, their proud bearing finally broken. Around her, passengers applauded, phones still recording every moment. No, she said quietly, though Victoria couldn't hear her anymore. But I'm at peace. Thomas touched her shoulder. It's really over now. Isabella nodded, but her mind was already turning to the work ahead, the communities still needing help, the corporate wrongdoers still needing exposure, the truth still needing champions. Her phone buzzed one last time, a message from one of her former kindergarten students. Miss Montgomery, my mom showed me the news. You're like a superhero now. Isabella smiled, touching her locket. Sometimes the best lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. As rain fell over Boston, washing away the last traces of the Preston Empire, Isabella Montgomery stood tall, ready for whatever came next. She had lost everything once, only to find her true purpose. And now, with the truth finally free, she could begin the next chapter of her story. But first, she had a classroom to visit. After all, there were always new lessons to teach. 1 year later, Isabella Montgomery stood at the podium of Harvard Business School's largest auditorium, facing a packed crowd of students, journalists, and corporate leaders. The spring sunshine streamed through the windows, catching the silver streak she now wore proudly in her brown hair, a reminder of everything she'd survived. The Preston case wasn't just about one family's corruption, she began, her voice strong and clear. It was about the choice we all face, to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, or to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. In the front row, Sarah sat beside Michael, both now key executives at the Renaissance Foundation. Thomas Preston, looking healthy and confident in his third year of sobriety, nodded encouragingly from his seat next to them. James Crawford, recently appointed to head the SEC's new Corporate Accountability Division, watched proudly from the back. Today, I'm announcing that the Renaissance Foundation is launching the Truth Matters initiative, Isabella continued. A $50 million program to protect and support corporate whistleblowers, funded entirely by the settlements from Preston Industries and its executives. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, the very money that had once fueled corruption was now being used to fight it. In their separate prison cells, Alexander, Victoria, and Margaret Preston would soon hear about this final transformation of their legacy. After the announcement, Isabella found herself in her old classroom at Brighton Elementary. The walls were covered with new artwork, but her old reading corner remained unchanged. Her replacement, a young teacher named Emily, had invited her to speak to the class. Miss Montgomery, several of her former students, now a year older, called out in excitement. "She's not just Miss Montgomery anymore," one girl announced proudly. "She's like a real-life superhero who fights bad guys in business suits." Isabella laughed, settling into her old reading chair. "Actually, I want to tell you a story about something more important than fighting bad guys. I want to tell you about telling the truth, even when it's hard." As she spoke to the children, her phone buzzed quietly, a message from Andrea Sullivan. "Breaking news, Alexander Preston granted limited immunity in exchange for testimony against international corporate fraud ring." Isabella smiled slightly. Alexander had finally chosen truth over pride, though it had taken losing everything to get him there. His testimony would help the foundation expose 3 more companies involved in environmental cover-ups. That evening, Isabella hosted a small dinner at her new home in Beacon Hill. Sarah, Michael, Thomas, James, and Andrea gathered around her table, the unlikely family she'd found through adversity. 1 year ago today, Thomas raised his glass of sparkling water. "We watched my mother and Victoria being led away at Logan Airport. I never thought I'd say this, but that was the day our family's legacy finally changed for the better." Speaking of legacy, Sarah added, "Did you hear? They're turning the old Preston Industries building into a center for environmental research and corporate accountability." Life does have a sense of irony, Isabella mused. "But there's something else we need to discuss." She pulled out a folder. The foundation's investigators found something in Singapore. Another company, twice the size of Preston Industries, with similar patterns of cover-ups and corruption. Michael groaned playfully. "Don't we deserve a vacation first?" "Actually," Isabella smiled, "I was thinking about taking a step back from this one." She turned to Sarah. "You've more than proven yourself this past year. I think it's time you led an investigation." Sarah's eyes widened. "Me? But..." "You understand both sides now," Isabella explained. "The pressure to stay quiet, and the courage to speak up. The Singapore case needs your perspective." Later that night, after her guests had left, Isabella walked through her garden. The stars shone brightly over Boston, and in the distance, the lights of the city sparkled like promises kept. Her phone rang, an unknown number. "Ms. Montgomery? This is Claire Wilson from the Nobel Committee. We're calling about your nomination for the Peace Prize." Isabella smiled, thinking of how far she'd come from that broken-hearted bride in a torn wedding dress. The prize wasn't important, what mattered were the lives changed, the truths revealed, the justice served. She touched her locket, now containing a new photo alongside the old one of her students. This one showed her team at the foundation, all of them smiling, all of them fighting for truth in their own ways. The next morning, Isabella stood in front of her mirror, preparing for another day of work. But first, she had a stop to make. Walking into the Lancaster Hotel, the very place where her wedding had fallen apart, she felt no pain, no regret. The hotel manager greeted her warmly. "Ms. Montgomery, everything is ready for the Foundation's youth education program." Where she had once walked down the aisle in white, children from underprivileged communities would now learn about environmental science, corporate responsibility, and the power of speaking up for what's right. "Perfect," she replied. "Let's give these kids the future they deserve." As she watched the children file in, their eyes wide with wonder at the grand ballroom, Isabella remembered something she'd told her kindergarten class years ago: sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Ready for our meeting with the Senate committee next week? They're finally ready to vote on the Corporate Accountability Act." Before she could reply, another message came through, from Alexander, sent through his lawyer. "I know it's too late for apologies, but I want you to know, you proved me wrong about everything. The world needs more teachers like you." Isabella thought carefully before responding. It's never too late to teach or to learn the right lessons. She looked up at the crystal chandeliers that had once witnessed her humiliation. Now they sparkled down on a room full of young minds learning to question, to challenge, to seek truth. Sarah arrived with the day's schedule. "The Singapore team is ready for their briefing. The SEC needs your input on the new whistleblower protection guidelines, and..." She paused, smiling. "Your old student Jimmy is here. The one who called you a superhero? He wrote a story about you for his school newspaper." Isabella took the carefully folded paper Sarah offered. Jimmy's article was titled "My Teacher, the Truth Teller," and began with words that brought tears to her eyes. "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who help others find their strength." "Ms. Montgomery?" One of the children raised her hand. "Is it true that you stood up to rich and powerful people all by yourself?" Isabella looked around the room, at Sarah, her betrayer turned loyal friend, at Michael, whose technical genius had helped expose the truth, at Thomas, who had found the courage to confront his own family, at all the people who had chosen to stand with her for what was right. "No," she answered honestly. "I was never by myself. And that's the most important lesson of all: when you stand up for the truth, you'll find others who will stand with you." As she began the day's lesson, Isabella caught her reflection in one of the ballroom's mirrors. The broken-hearted bride was gone, replaced by a woman who had turned pain into purpose, betrayal into strength, and revenge into justice. Outside, Boston sparkled in the morning sun, a city forever changed by one teacher's courage to speak truth to power. The Preston Empire had fallen, but something far more valuable had risen in its place: hope. And in classrooms, boardrooms, and courtrooms across the country, others were finding their voices, inspired by the story of a woman who had lost everything only to find her true calling. Isabella Montgomery had come full circle, and her greatest lesson would echo through generations. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is living well and helping others do the same.